On the night of September 15, 1935, the sky above Nuremberg blazed with light. 130 searchlights borrowed from the Luftwaffe's anti-aircraft batteries pointed straight up into the darkness, their beams converging miles above the earth to form what the architect Albert Speer called a cathedral of light. Within this ethereal structure of luminescence, over 100,000 people had gathered in the Zeppelin field, arranged in geometric precision, block after block of brown-shirted Seamen, black-clad SS, uniformed Hitler Youth, and civilians in their Sunday best. The spectacle was overwhelming by design. The individual disappeared into the mass. The mass became an instrument of the Führer's will. When Hitler spoke, his words echoed across the field, amplified by loudspeakers that carried his voice to every corner of the vast assembly. When he paused, the silence was absolute. When he raised his arm in salute, 100,000 arms rose in response. This was the Nuremberg Rally of 1935, the seventh such annual gathering and perhaps the most significant. On this night, Hitler announced laws that would transform the persecution of Jews from sporadic violence and administrative harassment into systematic legal discrimination. The Reich citizenship law stripped Jews of German citizenship, reducing them to subjects without political rights. The law for the protection of German blood and German honor prohibited marriages and sexual relations between Jews and citizens of German or related blood. Jews were forbidden to employ German women under the age of 45 as domestic servants. They were forbidden to fly the German flag. As Hitler read out the provisions, the crowd roared its approval. This was what they had been promised. Action against the Jews who Nazi propaganda claimed had caused all of Germany's problems. The laws gave legal form to the hatred that had been cultivated for years in speeches, newspapers, and street violence. Standing at the podium, illuminated by spotlights while darkness surrounded him, Hitler embodied the power of the new Germany. Behind him, the swastika banner hung from a structure over 100 feet tall. Before him, the faithful waited to receive his words like a congregation awaiting scripture. A foreign correspondent watching the scene wrote afterward, "This is not politics as we understand it." This is something new, part political rally, part religious ceremony, part theatrical production. The effect is overwhelming. One understands watching this how millions of Germans have surrendered themselves to this man. Reason has nothing to do with it. This is faith. This is the story of the Third Reich in power, of how the Nazi state organized itself, consolidated its control, persecuted its victims, and prepared for the war of conquest that Hitler had always intended, of how a modern nation transformed itself into an engine of destruction, of how the regime that had seized power in 1933 used the years that followed to build the machinery of genocide and world war. This is the story of Germany between 1933 and 1938, years of consolidation, rearmament, and the systematic persecution that would culminate in the Holocaust. Years when the world watched, uncertain, as Hitler broke treaty after treaty, gamble after gamble, and won every time. Years when the Third Reich revealed what it truly was. To understand the Third Reich in power, we must first understand how the Nazi state actually functioned. In theory, the Third Reich was a centralized dictatorship with Hitler at the apex of all power. In practice, it was something far stranger, a chaotic system of competing power centers, overlapping jurisdictions, and institutional rivalries, all held together by the person of the Führer. Hitler's style of rule was deliberately ambiguous. He issued general directives, but rarely specific orders. He appointed multiple subordinates with overlapping responsibilities and let them fight for supremacy. He avoided written commands when possible, preferring oral instructions that could be denied or reinterpreted. The result was a system in which subordinates competed to anticipate and fulfill what they believed to be Hitler's wishes, working toward the Führer, in the phrase of one Nazi official. This system had several consequences. It fostered radicalization, as subordinates tried to outdo each other in implementing Nazi ideology. It created inefficiency as agencies duplicated efforts and worked at cross purposes. And it concentrated ultimate power in Hitler, who remained the only figure who could arbitrate disputes and set direction. The traditional institutions of the German state, The ministries, the civil service, the courts continued to exist and to function. But alongside them grew a parallel structure of Nazi party organizations that answered directly to Hitler and his closest associates. The result was a dual state in which the normal bureaucracy handled routine matters while the party apparatus handled anything politically sensitive. At the center of this system stood the Führer himself. Hitler rose late, worked irregular hours, spent much of his time in monologues at the dinner table, and increasingly withdrew to his mountain retreat at Berchtesgaden. He disliked routine paperwork and avoided detailed involvement in administration. Yet his power was absolute. Every major decision, and many minor ones, required his approval. The entire system revolved around his person, his prejudices, and his will. Beneath Hitler, several power centers competed for influence. Hermann Göring accumulated more titles and responsibilities than any other Nazi leader. He was Minister-President of Prussia, commander of the Luftwaffe Reich, master of the Hunt Reich, master of the forests, and from 1936, director of the four-year plan that controlled the German economy. His corpulent figure, bedecked with medals and jewels, was a staple of Nazi propaganda. Göring was brutal, greedy, and vain, but also politically shrewd and personally charming. He was Hitler's designated successor throughout the pre-war period. Heinrich Himmler controlled the SS, the Gestapo, and the concentration camps. Quiet, meticulous, and utterly ruthless, Himmler built an empire of terror that eventually rivaled the state itself. Under his direction, the SS evolved from Hitler's bodyguard into a racial elite force with its own military units, economic enterprises, and administrative apparatus. Himmler was the architect of the Holocaust, the man who transformed Nazi racial ideology into systematic murder. Joseph Goebbels, as Minister of Propaganda, controlled the press, radio, film, and all public expression. His genius for manipulation and his fanatical devotion to Hitler made him indispensable. Goebbels was the voice of the regime, the man who crafted its message and ensured that message reached every German. EO figures played important roles. Rudolf Hess as Hitler's deputy for party affairs. Martin Bormann as Hitler's private secretary and gatekeeper. Joachim von Ribbentrop as foreign minister. The military leaders who commanded the expanding armed forces. But the Nazi system was not a government in any conventional sense. It was a court centered on the person of the Führer in which favor was everything, and institutions were secondary. The economic transformation of Germany under the Nazis was remarkable in its speed, if not in its sustainability. When Hitler took power in January 1933, Germany had over 6 million unemployed, nearly a third of the workforce. The Depression had devastated industry, agriculture, and finance. Confidence had collapsed. The human misery was immense. By 1936, unemployment had fallen below 1 million. By 1938, Germany faced a labor shortage. The economic recovery was the foundation of Hitler's popularity, the proof that the Nazi regime could deliver where democracy had failed. The man initially responsible for this recovery was not a Nazi ideologue, but a traditional conservative banker, Hjalmar Schacht. As president of the Reichsbank and Minister of Economics, Schacht implemented policies that stimulated the economy through deficit spending on a massive scale. The key to Schacht's approach was work creation programs, public works projects that employed millions of Germans on infrastructure construction. The most famous was the Autobahn, the network of high-speed highways that became a symbol of Nazi modernity. But the programs also built public buildings, housing, canals, and agricultural improvements. The government borrowed to fund these projects using ingenious financial instruments that obscured the true level of debt. Schacht also negotiated bilateral trade agreements with countries in southeastern Europe and Latin America, securing access to raw materials that Germany needed. He implemented exchange controls that prevented capital from leaving the country. He manipulated the currency to promote exports while limiting imports. His policies were economically unorthodox but politically effective. The recovery was real but also misleading. Much of the decline in unemployment came from removing workers from the labor force, women encouraged to leave work and return to the home, Jews dismissed from their jobs, political opponents imprisoned in camps. The statistics were massaged to show improvement where reality was more complicated. More fundamentally, the recovery was driven increasingly by rearmament. From 1935 onward, military spending became the dominant force in the German economy. Factories that had been idle began producing tanks, aircraft, warships, and weapons. Workers who had been unemployed found jobs in armaments production. The economic miracle was, at its core, preparation for war. Schacht grew increasingly alarmed at the scale of military spending and the inflationary pressures it created. He warned that Germany was heading for an economic crisis if rearmament continued at its current pace. Hitler was unmoved. Economics would have to serve politics, not the other way around. In 1936, Hitler announced the four-year plan, a program to prepare Germany for war within 4 years. Hermann Göring was placed in charge over Schacht's objections. The plan prioritized autarky, self-sufficiency, over economic efficiency. Germany would produce synthetic rubber, synthetic fuel, and other materials to reduce dependence on imports that might be cut off in wartime. The four-year plan marked a fundamental shift in economic policy. The aim was no longer recovery or prosperity, but war readiness. Resources were directed to military production regardless of cost. Consumer goods were neglected. The German people were told that guns were more important. Schacht resigned as economics minister in 1937, though he remained at the Reichsbank until 1939. His departure marked the triumph of Nazi ideology over economic rationality. The economy would now serve Hitler's goals of conquest, whatever the cost. Adam Tooze, in his magisterial study, The Wages of Destruction, has argued that the Nazi economy was always unsustainable, that Hitler knew Germany could not match the resources of its potential enemies and therefore intended to use aggressive war to seize those resources before his enemies could mobilize. The four-year plan was not a program for long-term development, but for short-term war preparation. Germany was racing against time, and Hitler intended to strike before his window closed. While the economy was transformed, Heinrich Himmler was building the SS into an instrument of total terror. The Schutzstaffel, or protection squad, had begun as Hitler's personal bodyguard, a small unit distinguished by their black uniforms and fanatical loyalty. Under Himmler, who took command in 1929, it became something far more ambitious, a racial elite, a state within the state, and ultimately the instrument of genocide. Himmler was an unlikely figure for such a role. He was physically unimposing, bespectacled, with a weak chin and a pedantic manner. He had never served in the First World War, having been too young. He trained as an agronomist and ran a chicken farm before devoting himself to the Nazi movement. But behind his colorless exterior lay an organizational genius and an absolute commitment to Nazi racial ideology. Himmler conceived of the SS as a new aristocracy based on blood rather than birth. SS recruits were selected according to racial criteria. They had to prove their Aryan ancestry back to 1750, had to meet height and physical requirements, and had to demonstrate ideological commitment. They were trained in both military skills and the Nazi worldview. They saw themselves as a warrior elite, the vanguard of the racial state. The CSS expanded rapidly after 1933. The Allgemeine SS, or General SS, comprised the mass membership, eventually over 200,000 men who wore the black uniform part-time while holding other jobs. The SS Verfügungstruppe, later renamed the Waffen-SS, became a military force parallel to the army. The SS Totenkopfverband, the Death's Head units, guarded the concentration camps, and the Securitätsdienst, or SD, was the intelligence service of the SS. Reinhard Heydrich, Himmler's chief deputy, commanded the SD. Heydrich was everything Himmler was not: tall, athletic, coldly handsome, and utterly terrifying. He had been cashiered from the Navy for a scandal involving a woman, and he brought to the SD a ruthless efficiency that made it the most feared organization in Germany. Heydrich built files on everyone: Nazi officials, army officers, businessmen, ordinary citizens, creating a surveillance apparatus that penetrated every aspect of German life. In 1936, Himmler was named chief of German police, unifying the SS and the police under his command. This merger created a system of control with unprecedented reach. The Gestapo, the secret police, could arrest anyone without a warrant and hold them indefinitely without trial. The SD monitored public opinion and reported on any sign of dissent. The concentration camps stood ready to receive those deemed enemies of the state. The camps themselves evolved during these years. What had begun in 1933 as improvised detention centers for political opponents became a permanent system under Theodor Dieck's direction. The major camps, Dachau, Sachsenhausen, Buchenwald, were organized according to standardized regulations. Prisoners were stripped of identity, subjected to arbitrary brutality, worked to exhaustion, and kept in constant fear. Death was common, from beatings, from disease, from despair. The camp population fluctuated. After the initial wave of arrests in 1933, many political prisoners were released. But the categories of those imprisoned expanded over time. Jehovah's Witnesses who refused military service, homosexuals, habitual criminals, asocials who did not conform to Nazi expectations, and always, increasingly, Jews. The SS developed its own economic enterprises using camp labor to quarry stone, manufacture bricks, and produce goods. This economic dimension would expand enormously during the war when millions of prisoners would be worked to death for the German war effort. But even in the peacetime years, the camps were not just instruments of terror, but economic operations that profited from the labor of those they imprisoned. The persecution of Jews escalated steadily throughout the 1930s, moving from street violence and economic discrimination toward the systematic legal exclusion that the Nuremberg Laws represented. The initial months after Hitler took power saw a wave of violence against Jews, beatings, vandalism, and boycotts organized by the SA. This violence was largely spontaneous, driven by local Nazi activists rather than central direction. It alarmed the conservative elites who had brought Hitler to power and created problems for the regime internationally. The regime's initial approach was to channel anti-Jewish sentiment into legal measures rather than street violence. The law for the restoration of the professional civil service of April 1933 was the first major anti-Jewish legislation, requiring the dismissal of non-Aryan civil servants. Similar laws soon applied to lawyers, doctors, teachers, and other professionals. But the definition of who was a Jew proved surprisingly complicated. Nazi ideology was based on race, not religion. A Jew remained a Jew, even if baptized as a Christian. But how was race to be determined? Blood tests could not distinguish Jews from non-Jews. Appearance was unreliable. In practice, the regime fell back on ancestry. You were Jewish if you had Jewish grandparents. But what about those with mixed ancestry? The misclinged people of partial Jewish descent posed particular problems. The Nuremberg Laws of September 1935 attempted to resolve these questions while codifying discrimination at a new level. The laws themselves were hastily drafted. Hitler demanded legislation for the party rally, and bureaucrats scrambled to produce something. The result was a framework that required extensive supplementary regulations to implement. Under the laws and their implementing decrees, Jews were defined as those with 3 or 4 Jewish grandparents, or those with 2 Jewish grandparents who belonged to the Jewish community, or were married to a Jew. Misclinge of the first degree, 2 Jewish grandparents, and misclinge of the second degree, 1 Jewish grandparent, occupied intermediate categories with varying degrees of restriction. The laws prohibited marriage between Jews and German citizens. They prohibited sexual relations outside marriage between Jews and Germans. They prohibited Jews from employing German women under 45 as domestic servants. These provisions were justified in pseudoscientific terms as necessary to protect the purity of German blood. The consequences for German Jews were devastating. Already second-class citizens economically and professionally, they were now legally excluded from the German national community. A wall had been built, legally, publicly, irrevocably, between Jews and their neighbors. One Jewish woman later recalled, "After the Nuremberg Laws, we knew we were finished in Germany. It was not just that we lost our jobs, our businesses, our place in society. We lost our country. We had thought of ourselves as Germans. Our families had lived here for centuries. And now we were told we had never been Germans and never could be. We were stateless in our own homeland. The international reaction was muted. Some countries protested. The League of Nations High Commissioner for Refugees tried to help those who fled. But no country opened its doors wide to Jewish immigration. When Hitler watched the world's tepid response, he concluded that the democracies would not fight to protect the Jews. He would remember this lesson. While domestic consolidation continued, Hitler pursued an increasingly aggressive foreign policy that systematically demolished the restrictions imposed by the Treaty of Versailles. In March 1935, Hitler announced that Germany would no longer be bound by the disarmament provisions of Versailles. Germany would create a new air force, the Luftwaffe, and would expand its army through conscription. The announcement was a direct violation of the treaty, but Britain and France responded only with protests. On March 7, 1936, German troops marched into the Rhineland. The German territory west of the Rhine and a strip east of it, had been demilitarized by both Versailles and Locarno. Germany was forbidden to station troops there to build fortifications or to maintain military installations. The demilitarization was meant to protect France. If Germany ever attacked, its forces would have to cross the unfortified Rhineland, giving France time to mobilize. Hitler's decision to remilitarize the Rhineland was his most dangerous gamble to date. The German army was still weak. Only 3 battalions crossed the Rhine initially. If France had responded with force, Germany would have had to retreat. Hitler himself later admitted the 48 hours after the march were the most nerve-wracking of his life. But France did not respond with force. The French government, divided and uncertain, consulted with Britain. The British government, which saw the Rhineland as Germany's own backyard, refused to commit to military action. The League of Nations condemned the violation but took no action. Hitler had won. The remilitarization of the Rhineland was a turning point. It demonstrated that Hitler could violate treaties with impunity, that the democratic powers would protest but not act. It strengthened Hitler's position domestically, proving that his bold approach to foreign policy paid dividends. And it eliminated the main strategic protection that France had relied upon. With German troops and fortifications in the Rhineland, a French offensive to support Eastern allies became vastly more difficult. General Ludwig Beck, the chief of the Army General Staff, had opposed the remilitarization, fearing that France would intervene and that Germany would be defeated. When France failed to act, Beck and other skeptical officers were discredited. Hitler's judgment had been vindicated. He would trust it again in future crises. The summer of 1936 brought the Berlin Olympics, the greatest propaganda spectacle of the Nazi era. Hitler had initially been skeptical of the Olympics. He saw them as an invention of Jews and Freemasons, tainted by internationalism and racial mixing. But Goebbels persuaded him that the Games could be a showcase for Nazi Germany, an opportunity to present the regime to the world in its best light. The regime prepared meticulously. Berlin was cleaned and beautified. Anti-Jewish signs were temporarily removed. The virulence of anti-Jewish persecution was moderated, temporarily, to avoid offending foreign visitors. The Games themselves were staged with unprecedented grandeur, beginning with a torch relay from Olympia in Greece and culminating in spectacular opening and closing ceremonies. The results exceeded Nazi expectations. Germany won more medals than any other country, 89 total, including 33 gold. German athletes were celebrated as exemplars of Aryan excellence. The organization was flawless. Foreign visitors were impressed by the cleanliness, the efficiency, and the hospitality. Many returned home with favorable impressions of the new Germany. The American journalist William Shearer, stationed in Berlin, watched with alarm. I'm afraid that Nazis have succeeded with their propaganda. First, the party has put up a great show for the visitors. The Games have run off smoothly. The visitors have seen a clean, smiling Germany. They have not seen the concentration camps, the persecution of the Jews, the suppression of free speech. There were complications. Jesse Owens, the African-American track star, won 4 gold medals, demolishing the Nazi claim of Aryan athletic superiority. Hitler reportedly refused to shake Owens's hand, though the exact circumstances remain disputed. But the propaganda victory was not seriously dented. The world had seen Nazi Germany at its best, and many were impressed. The Olympics also brought practical benefits. International confidence in Germany was boosted, facilitating foreign investment and trade. The regime demonstrated its organizational capabilities. And the temporary moderation of persecution showed that the regime could control its more radical impulses when expedient, a lesson that would have sinister implications later. Behind the spectacle, Hitler was preparing for war. On November 5, 1937, Hitler summoned his foreign minister, his war minister, and the commanders of the Army, Navy, and Air Force to a secret meeting at the Reich Chancellery. For over 4 hours, he laid out his thinking on Germany's future. The meeting was recorded by Colonel Friedrich Hossbach, the military adjutant, whose notes became known as the Hossbach Memorandum. The document has been controversial. Some historians question its accuracy, others its significance, but it provides crucial insight into Hitler's intentions. Hitler began by declaring that German policy aimed to secure and preserve the racial community and to enlarge it. Germany needed living space, Lebensraum, to support its population. This space could only be found in Europe, specifically in the East. The question was not whether to expand, but when and how. Germany's problem was time. The rearmament program gave Germany a temporary military advantage, but other powers were rearming as well. By 1943-1945, Germany's relative strength would begin to decline. Therefore, action must be taken before that window closes. Hitler outlined 3 scenarios. First, if France were paralyzed by an internal crisis, Germany could move against Austria and Czechoslovakia immediately. Second, if France were engaged in war with another power, he suggested Italy, Germany could act against Czechoslovakia. Third, in any case, Germany must be ready to act by 1943-1945 at the latest. The military leaders present were skeptical. War Minister Werner von Blomberg and Army Commander Werner von Fritsch warned that Germany was not ready for war with France and Britain. They questioned Hitler's assumptions about French weakness and British reluctance to fight. Hitler dismissed their concerns. The Hossbach Memorandum was not a blueprint for war. It did not specify dates, targets, or operational plans, but it revealed Hitler's mindset. He was determined to go to war. He believed that war must come soon, before Germany's window of opportunity closed. He was prepared to risk conflict with the major powers to achieve his goals. Those who hoped that Hitler might be satisfied with the revision of Versailles, that he might be a normal statesman whose ambitions could be accommodated, were deceiving themselves. Hitler wanted conquest. He had said so in Mein Kampf. He was saying so to his military commanders. The only question was when and how. Within months of the Hossbach meeting, Hitler moved to consolidate his control over the military. The occasion was the Blomberg-Fritsch Affair of January-February 1938, a sordid episode that revealed both the sleaziness of Nazi intrigue and Hitler's ruthless exploitation of opportunity. Werner von Blomberg, the war minister, was a widower who had married a much younger woman in January 1938. Hitler and Göring had been witnesses at the wedding, but shortly after the ceremony, the police presented evidence that Blomberg's new wife had a past as a prostitute and had posed for pornographic photographs. The scandal was devastating. Blomberg was forced to resign. Simultaneously, Werner von Fritsch, the army commander-in-chief, was accused of homosexuality based on evidence fabricated by the SS. The charge was false. Fritsch was the victim of mistaken identity or deliberate frame-up, but he was forced to resign pending investigation. Although he was eventually cleared by a court of honor, he never returned to command. The twin scandals allowed Hitler to restructure the military leadership. He abolished the war ministry and created in its place the Oberkommando der Wacht, OKWA, the High Command of the Armed Forces, under his personal direction. Wilhelm Keitel, a compliant general who would remain loyal to Hitler until the end, became chief of the OCDLBA. Walther von Bruschisch, another pliable figure, became army commander-in-chief. Hitler was now not just a supreme political leader, but a supreme military commander. The independence of the officer corps, which had survived even the night of the Long Knives, was broken. The army would now follow Hitler's orders without institutional resistance. The restructuring extended beyond the top positions. 16 generals were retired. 44 others were transferred. The foreign ministry was also reshuffled, with the compliant Ribbentrop replacing the more cautious Neurath. Hitler surrounded himself with subordinates who would execute his orders without question. The road to war was now clear. The foreign policy apparatus was staffed with yes men. The military was under Hitler's direct control. The economy was geared for war production. The population was indoctrinated with Nazi ideology. All that remained was to find the occasion for war. What was life like for ordinary Germans during these years of consolidation and preparation? For those who were neither targeted for persecution nor actively opposed to the regime, the mid-1930s could seem like a time of national renewal. Unemployment had fallen. The economy was growing. Germany was respected, or at least feared abroad. The humiliations of Versailles were being swept away. There was a sense of purpose, of national unity, of moving forward after the chaos of the Weimar years. The regime worked hard to create this impression. Nazi organizations penetrated every aspect of life. The German Labor Front replaced the abolished trade unions, organizing workers into a structure that combined welfare benefits with political control. The Strength Through Joy program offered leisure activities, cruises, concerts, sports facilities that had previously been available only to the wealthy. The regime presented itself as a people's movement, breaking down class barriers and creating a true national community. The Hitler Youth organized children and adolescents, indoctrinating them with Nazi ideology while providing outdoor activities, sports, and camaraderie. By 1936, membership was effectively mandatory. Young Germans grew up knowing no other political reality, absorbing Nazi values as naturally as they learned to read and write. Women were pushed toward domestic roles, kinder Kuch, Kirch, children, kitchen, church, but the reality was more complicated. The regime needed female labor and could not entirely exclude women from the workforce. Nazi women's organizations provided an outlet for activism within prescribed limits. Many women found meaning in the roles the regime offered them. The churches occupied an ambiguous position. The regime had signed a concordat with the Catholic Church in 1933, promising to respect Catholic institutions in exchange for the Church's withdrawal from political activity. Many Catholic clergy complied, some resisted. The Protestant churches were more divided, with the German Christians supporting the regime and the confessing church opposing Nazi interference in church affairs. For those who conformed, who joined the required organizations, who gave the Hitler salute, who did not ask too many questions, life could proceed with relative normality. The terror was selective, aimed at Jews, at political opponents, at those who defied the regime. Most Germans were neither victims nor perpetrators, but bystanders who accommodated themselves to the new order. One German woman, looking back decades later, described the ambivalence. We knew things were happening that were not right. We saw our Jewish neighbors lose their shops, their jobs, their dignity. But what could we do? We had children to raise, jobs to keep, lives to live. We told ourselves it was not our business, that the Jews must have done something wrong, that it would pass. We made our peace with the regime because the alternative was unthinkable. This accommodation, the willingness of millions of ordinary Germans to go along with the regime, to look the other way, to tell themselves that it was not their concern, made the Nazi system possible. The dictatorship rested not just on terror but on consent, on the active support of true believers and the passive acceptance of everyone else. For Germany's Jews, the years from 1933 to 1938 were years of progressive exclusion, humiliation, and loss. The pace of persecution varied. Aryanization of Jewish businesses proceeded apace. Forced sales at a fraction of true value, transfers to Aryan ownership, or simple confiscation. Jewish children were increasingly segregated in schools or excluded altogether. Public spaces, parks, swimming pools, and theaters were closed to Jews. The social isolation was perhaps even more painful than the legal exclusion. Neighbors who had been friends for years stopped speaking. Shopkeepers refused to serve Jewish customers. Children were taught to shun their Jewish classmates. The social fabric that had integrated Jews into German life for generations was torn apart. Some Jews emigrated. By 1938, perhaps 150,000 of Germany's 525,000 Jews had left, most going to neighboring European countries, some to Palestine, some to the Americas. But emigration was difficult. The regime imposed a flight tax that stripped emigrants of much of their wealth. Destination countries imposed quotas and restrictions. Many Jews, especially the elderly, could not or would not leave. They hoped the persecution would pass, that Germany would come to its senses, that they could wait it out. Those who left often found that their destination countries were not welcoming. The Evian Conference of 1938, convened to address the refugee crisis, produced almost no results. Country after country expressed sympathy, but refused to open its doors. The message was clear. The world did not want the Jews either. One German Jewish teenager who emigrated to the United States in 1937 later recalled, "We felt we were leaving our country, our language, everything we knew. My parents had been so proud to be German. Now we were nothing, not German anymore, not yet American, just refugees that nobody wanted. The hardest part was saying goodbye to grandparents who were too old to leave. We never saw them again. The worst was yet to come." In November 1938, after the assassination of a German diplomat by a young Jewish man in Paris, the regime would unleash Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, a nationwide pogrom that destroyed synagogues, looted businesses, killed over 90 Jews, and sent 30,000 to concentration camps. But that story belongs to the next episode. As 1938 began, the Third Reich stood at the height of its power and on the threshold of expansion. Domestically, the regime had consolidated total control. All opposition had been crushed or silenced. The economy was growing. The population was increasingly indoctrinated. The instruments of terror, the Gestapo, the SS, the concentration camps, were in place and functioning. The military was rebuilt and growing rapidly. The Luftwaffe, which had not existed in 1933, was now the largest air force in Europe. The army had grown from 100,000 men to over 500,000, with plans for further expansion. The Navy was building battleships and submarines that would challenge British control of the seas. Germany was no longer bound by any of the military restrictions of Versailles. Internationally, Hitler had broken treaty after treaty without consequence. He had withdrawn from the League of Nations, renounced the disarmament provisions of Versailles, remilitarized the Rhineland, and begun to build a war economy. Each time, the democracies had protested but not acted. Hitler had learned that boldness paid, that the democracies would not fight to enforce the post-war order. The Hossbach Memorandum had revealed Hitler's intentions to his military leaders. He was determined to move against Austria and Czechoslovakia. He was prepared for war with France and Britain if necessary. He believed that Germany must act soon before its window of opportunity closed. In the Foreign Office, in the military high command, in the industrial leadership, some worried about the direction Hitler was taking. Some feared that he was moving too fast, that Germany was not ready for war with the major powers. Some feared that he was too radical, that his racial policies were damaging Germany's international position. But these voices were marginalized or silenced. The skeptics had been proven wrong before, in the Rhineland, in the remilitarization, and Hitler's judgment had been vindicated. The mass of the German people supported their Führer. He had restored employment, rebuilt national pride, and overcome the humiliations of Versailles. If his methods were sometimes harsh, that was the price of national revival. If Jews and other undesirables suffered, that was not the concern of ordinary Germans. The future seemed bright. They could not know what that future would actually bring. The war that would destroy their cities, kill their sons, and end in total defeat. They could not know about the genocide that would be committed in their name. They could not know that the leader they followed would lead them to catastrophe. But the foundations had been laid. The Third Reich in power had created the machinery of war and genocide. All that remained was to set it in motion. The Third Reich, between 1933 and 1938, was a study in the construction of totalitarian power. In 5 years, a modern democracy had been transformed into a dictatorship. A nation of laws had become a nation ruled by the will of one man. A society that had produced Goethe and Beethoven had embraced a regime based on hatred and violence. The transformation was not complete, would never be complete. There remained pockets of resistance, private doubts, and human decency that the regime could not entirely extinguish. The churches preserved some independence. The army retained some institutional pride. Ordinary Germans continued in their private lives to make choices that the regime could not control, but the direction was unmistakable. Each year brought more consolidation, more control, more preparation for the war that Hitler intended to fight. The racial persecution that began with discrimination would end in genocide. The military buildup that began with rearmament would end in World War. The regime that had promised national renewal would bring national destruction. Understanding these years is essential to understanding what followed. The Holocaust did not emerge from nowhere. It was prepared by years of persecution, propaganda, and dehumanization. The war did not begin by accident. It was planned, prepared, and initiated by a regime that saw war as its purpose. The catastrophe that consumed Europe had its origins in the choices made in Berlin between 1933 and 1938. The Third Reich in power was a machine being prepared for its true purpose. The machine was now ready. It awaited only the occasion to begin. Next time, we will witness Hitler's first conquests, the Anschluss with Austria and the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia. We will see how the policy of appeasement reached its climax at Munich, how the democracies sacrificed Czechoslovakia for a peace that would not last, and how the road to war became inevitable. The Third Reich in power would soon become the Third Reich at war. The machine was running. It would not stop until it had consumed everything in its path, including in the end itself.